So I really want to welcome you all. My name is Francesca Giovannini. I'm the Executive Director of the Project on Managing the Atom here at the Belfer Center. And it is my absolute pleasure, I have to say, to welcome Matt Furman, one of our wonderful, most outstanding former MTA fellows, back to an MTA event today. And I also want to welcome all the outstanding panelists who have agreed to speak to us today about the future orientation of the nuclear disarmament studies. Before I turn over to Matt, I just want to say a couple of words about how we came to convene this meeting. And I want to take a little bit of credit for me and for all the scholars who are around this video today. I want to say this is probably the very first event talking about nuclear disarmament that Harvard has convened in a rather long time. And we have decided to convene this event really to mark the first conference of the state parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. You know, when we started thinking about, this first conference of the state parties, one of the very first questions we ask is what is the space that the TPNW opens up for scholars and intellectuals to think or rethink the nuclear disarmament questions, right? What questions does the TPNW rise, and how can we tackle these questions? This event is particularly important, at least to me, because it comes actually as part of a very important initiative we've just launched, which is the research network on rethinking nuclear deterrence. This is a major effort of many academic institutions, some of them represented here on the screen today, to rethink the theory and practice of nuclear deterrence. So the network really begins with the fundamental assumption that nuclear deterrence is a theory, and as such has to be questioned, and its assumptions and principles have to be tested against empirical case studies. And this opens up, in our view, also some space to do some serious work on the nuclear disarmament side of the equation. And so we were particularly pleased to convene this and really to merge the practice and policy that is going to go on in Vienna very soon with the work that some of our most outstanding experts and scholars have done on the nuclear disarmament question. I want to turn it over to Matt Furman. I want to thank you so much, Matt, for agreeing to moderate this panel. And I want to thank again every one of you for joining us in this conversation today. Matt, over to you.
Thanks very much, Francesca. It's great to be here and great to see you all for this, what I think is a really important discussion on an enduring issue, nuclear disarmament, that continues to have relevance today. One interesting and important facet of what we're going to do today is think about this issue from a scholarly standpoint. That is, we're going to hear from 6 scholars who are doing really interesting and important work on this subject. And they're going to come at the issue from a social science and scholarly standpoint. And I think that's significant because a lot of times the issue of disarmament can have an advocacy type flair. Of course, the work that everyone's carrying out has obvious policy implications, which we'll tease out in our discussion, hopefully. But everyone here is going to be sharing some of the insights from their scholarship as well. So I'd like to take a moment just to briefly introduce the people who will be speaking on this panel. Again, I'm Matt Furman. I'm a professor of political science at Texas A&M University and a former fellow at the Belfer Center back in 2007 and 2008. We'll be hearing first from Rebecca Gibbons, who is an assistant professor at the University of Southern Maine. And she'll be followed by Stephen Herzog, who is a senior researcher in nuclear arms control at the Center for Security Studies at ETH Zurich. We also have Hassan Elmbatimi, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of War Studies and director of the Center for Science and Security Studies at King's College London. Also on the panel is Olamide Samuels. He's a research associate in nuclear politics at the University of Leicester's School of History, Politics, and International Relations. Our fifth speaker will be Sholav Egland, who is a postdoctoral fellow in security studies at Sciences Po. And finally, we have Tamara Patton, who is currently a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at MIT's Security Studies program. So as you can see, we have a really interesting set of scholars here representing people from multiple countries, and they're going to bring a diversity of perspectives to this important issue. All of the speakers are going to take about 5 minutes to convey their remarks, and then I will kick off the discussion using my prerogative as moderator with some questions that come out of their remarks, and then we'll open the floor for discussion from the audience. So with that, let me turn things over to Dr. Gibbons.
All right, thank you so much, Matt. 5 minutes is a challenge, so I'm going to do my best, but I do want to thank Matt for being here to moderate this, all the other scholars, and to Francesca and Managing the Atom for holding this discussion. So my research in this area is focused on the treaty that Francesca mentioned, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. That is the new treaty that entered into force last year and bans or prohibits all nuclear weapons related activities. My first scholarship related to the TPNW was a brief history of the treaty and how it came about. And I'll ask Marina to link to that in the chat. This new treaty was born out of, I would say, the existing global nuclear architecture, especially the 1970 Non-Proliferation Treaty, known as the NPT. If you're on this call, you probably know this, but the NPT's Article 6 calls for all members of the treaty to pursue effective means towards eventual nuclear and general disarmament. And so in 2000, all the parties of the NPT met for their every 5-year review meeting, and all the parties were able to come to an agreement. As you know, this doesn't always happen at these every 5-year meetings, but in 2000, they were able to come to an agreement on what was known then as 13 practical steps towards disarmament. And this agreement was widely lauded within the international community, within the disarmament and non-proliferation communities, as a major political step forward in making more progress on nuclear disarmament. However, just 5 years later at the next conference, the parties were unable to come to consensus on these same 13 steps. And that was in part because the US administration at the time did not agree on all of them. And so after this 2005 conference, both diplomats from non-nuclear weapon states in the NPT and disarmament-focused NGOs became concerned. And so diplomats, and these are people I've interviewed over the past few years, they were worried about the sustainability of the NPT in the long run if they didn't see further progress on nuclear disarmament. They were worried about the legitimacy of this treaty. Members of a group known as the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, they sought a new means of promoting disarmament outside of the NPT framework. And I think that's really important, outside of the NPT framework. And they founded what we know now as ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. Eventually, some diplomats from non-nuclear weapon states and these activists would join together. The states would help with resources among the activists, and they started the Humanitarian Initiative, where there was these 3 humanitarian conferences in 2013 and 2014 that helps build momentum and eventually leads to negotiating the TPNW, which again entered into force in 2021. None of the NPT nuclear weapon states participated in these negotiations. They have forcefully, in action and rhetoric, rejected this new treaty. And so I provide all that background because the current research I am sharing today examines the normative contest between the NPT's 5 legitimate or official nuclear weapon states and those promoting the TPNW, those that want to ban nuclear weapons for all states. And so this topic broadly fits into a constructivist research agenda examining the life cycle of norms. So you may be familiar, early norm lit, say in the late 1990s, particularly by Finnemore and Sekink, talked about norms. First they emerge and then they cascade and then they become entrenched and taken for granted in the international system. But soon after, scholars pointed out that some norms never make it through that cycle some norms die, so they fade away, and that new norms are often strongly contested by those who favor the status quo, those who don't want to see this new norm emerge. And so for the past 6 or 7 years, I have followed the efforts to develop a treaty to ban nuclear weapons, as well as the ways in which the 5 NPT nuclear weapon states have responded to this treaty. And so this is, like I said, within a constructivist research agenda. And then more specifically, there's this increasing amount of literature on norm contestation or norm resistance. And so in the particular area I'm looking at, we have supporters of the ban treaty promoting a norm of non-possession for all. No state should have nuclear weapons. In contrast, the P5 favor working through the NPT, which enshrines a norm of selective possession, whereby these 5 states are legitimately allowed to have these weapons and they are legal possessors and the rest of the states are not. And so this norm of non-possession takes direct aim at nuclear deterrence and extended nuclear deterrence, which is why it is so concerning to the NPT's nuclear weapon states. And so I know I'm running out of time, but I'll just say that in studying how the P5 and particularly the US have tried to resist this norm and stop it from becoming entrenched, there have been several strategies or tools, and this is what I've been looking at. So for example, non-participation was one of the first ones, not showing up at the humanitarian conferences, not even showing up for the Nobel Prize ceremony when ICANN won the Nobel Prize, or at least not sending the high-level ambassadors. There's been lots of critical rhetoric about this treaty, particularly saying that it's going to be harmful and it's going to undermine and hurt the NPT. That's one of the strongest lines that's used against the treaty by the P5, that it's going to hurt the NPT. There's also been coercion. There was an example of a former Secretary of Defense telling the Swedish that they couldn't expect future help in, and this is before their NATO process or NATO ascension process began, but that they couldn't expect any help from the US if they were to join the treaty. And then they also begin or create new institutions. And I see the institution, the Creating the Environment for Nuclear Disarmament, which was created under the Trump administration, as being an example of trying to do something institutionally towards disarmament without being a part of this other effort. And so I think it's interesting because we might think that great powers have many advantages in trying to stop or resist new norms. And yet today we have this treaty with 61 states parties. It's about to have its first meeting next week. So we see this very active process of norm contestation going on right now. And so I think this treaty offers us a particularly interesting way to study norm change, norm resistance, and norm contestation. And thank you for listening to that very fast talk.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, let's turn it over to Stephen Herzog.
All right, I am going to share some slides here really quickly. So let's just make sure that those share. Can everybody see those? Okay. All right, wonderful. So thank you very much to MTA and Francesca for having me, and thanks as well to Matt Furman for agreeing to be here. Very excited to have all these people doing excellent work in the same place. It's nice. Today, we're going to talk about public opinion on the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And when I say public opinion on this, I think it's important in part because to date, we have 61 states parties to the TPNW and 86 countries that are state signatories. So whether or not you like the TPNW, whether or not you agree or disagree politically with the approach to the ban treaty is now part of the multilateral global nuclear order. And I think that's only going to be re-emphasized later this month with the first meeting of states parties of the TPNW in Vienna, which I assume that multiple people here on this call will be present for. Public opinion on nuclear issues is oftentimes very controversial. In principle, the public should probably care about nuclear issues and maybe be involved in nuclear issues because the threats and dangers presented by nuclear weapons, but it remains controversial. And, there are always debates when there are studies about does the public support the use of nuclear weapons and things like that. Does this actually matter? Does the public have any influence over this? I think the TPNW is a little bit different though. And that is, if you look from these quotes by ICANN head Beatrice Finn here, it's very clear that the ban movement in the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is based on this long-term idea of a bottom-up stigmatization of nuclear weapons. So getting the publics in nuclear armed states, states under the nuclear umbrella, and otherwise to not support nuclear weapons and the idea that nuclear weapons provide for security. So I think that this actually provides a lot of really relevant and very interesting opportunities to study public opinion on nuclear issues. So I want to talk today about some published research that Marina, I believe, has dropped or will soon drop in the chat. One is published in the Journal of Politics, and the other is published in the Journal for Peace and Nuclear Disarmament. And what they are is they're two public opinion studies conducted simultaneously in the year 2019 with two of my colleagues, Rebecca Davis Gibbons, who's here, and Jonathan Barron. And we conducted the studies in the United States, the nuclear armed state, and Japan, a country which is under the US wing, under the nuclear umbrella. And what we wanted to see is, will these governments who support on some level nuclear deterrence or extended deterrence be able to affect public support for what appears like a potentially popular emerging norm like nuclear non-possession? And a lot of the discourse that we see related to the ban treaty seems to be supportive on some level of the ban treaty, but there is government pushback. And we were interested to see, is that actually having an effect? Is that doing anything? So what we did in each of these countries is we did a survey experiment where we divided the groups, the populations in the United States and Japan, into 5 groups. First, we had a control or baseline group. They received basic information about the TPNW and its objectives, and then they were asked whether they wanted their government to ratify the treaty. Then there was a second group. They received that baseline information and then a statement noting their government's a national opposition to the TPNW because nuclear weapons are used for deterrence against nuclear armed states. Then there's a third group that received this control baseline text plus institutional messaging saying that the TPNW is a weak international institution with enforcement and verification issues. And then there was another group that received the baseline information and then information saying the TPNW had the potential to undermine the norms of the NPT regime. Whether or not you buy these arguments, these have external validity because these are the types of arguments that the US government and the Japanese government have substantively been making against the TPNW. And then finally, building on the work of Kurtzer and Zaitsev, we offered what we call a group Q, which involves mild deception. And the idea is to see if social pressure can influence your viewpoints related to a treaty. And so this is what we did is after people answered demographic questions and got the baseline text, this group Q group would also get this image on the screen, informing them that people who had similar demographics to them essentially had answered questions similarly, did not support the TPNW. Okay, so what do we find? What we found is that in the United States, it might be surprising, 64.7% of controller baseline group respondents, which is a strong majority of respondents, support TPNW ratification. But what we also found is that all of these treatment effects are strongly significant, all of the substantive cues and the group cues. They range from 8.1 to 19.2 percentage points, which is enough, 19.2, for example, to move people, full point on a Likert scale. And so what we see though is there are also some heterogeneous effects here where Republicans are affected the most by the security cue, Democrats by the institution cue, and otherwise. However, maybe people haven't heard of the TPNW. It has potentially low issue salience. So we did a follow-up survey on YouGov that you can see the results here. We asked people that they had heard of the TPNW, described what it did. We gave 4 options. Yes, and I support it. Yes, and I oppose it. No, I haven't heard of it, but it sounds like something I would support. And no, I haven't heard of it, but it sounds like something I would oppose. And you can see from the results there that 63.8% of people, a similar result, said they either support the TPNW or it sounds like something they would support. However, only 26.1% of Americans said that they had heard of the TPNW. And that may be questionable too. Maybe they confuse the TPNW with the NPT or something else. But the overall conclusion from this is that really there's still strong overt support for nuclear disarmament in the United States and latent support. So that also means that while there's this strong overt and latent support, that these kind of US government anti-normative cues are quite powerful. We did the same study in Japan, and the results are shockingly different. what we find is that, while all demographic groups in Japan across the board, liberal, conservative, anything, are income, education, are supportive of the TPNW, none of these treatments that the Japanese government is using, delivered in the Japanese language, can change Japanese public opinion. They're all not statistically significant. And so 75% of the Japanese population supports the TPNW in principle. Now let's conclude. And to conclude, what are the implications of this? Overall baseline level of support for the TPNW from social science research shows that it should be encouraging for advocates. In the United States and Japan, we're seeing high majorities of populations that support it. However, the American public, while we've seen studies before that show the American public supports nuclear disarmament in principle, maybe they don't know much about the ban, maybe they're not sold on the ban and can very easily be moved against the ban approach. The Japanese government, totally different situation. If public opinion on these issues matters, the Japanese government is not going to be able to hide from the TPNW. And so overall, I think this presents us with several new directions for research. Could these studies be done in other countries? Could there be different types of messaging used? Could we look at positive messaging in support of the TPNW, overlaying that with negative messaging? And where does it put us as far as simulating this information environment? So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Great, thank you for that interesting overview of your work. Now we'll turn it over to Hassan El-Batimi, excuse me.
Can you hear me? Fantastic, great. Thank you so much, Matthew and Francesca and everyone on the call, really. I'm really pleased to be here. I cannot really speak as fast as Rebecca and Stephen, so I tried to condense what I want to share with you so that I can fit in the 5 minutes allocated to me. So let's see how I can do that. What I want to share with you is some thinking that I've been doing on the MPT, and thinking about the MPT is far less fashionable these days compared to the new kid on the block, TPNW. But there is some form of idiosyncrasy that I've always felt as someone who's followed the MPT, attended these meetings, and also seen the analytical research and academic community talking about the MPT. And there is some kind of a mismatch between my experience of what's going on in negotiations and the sort of like power and how it's distributed in the conference hall, and then how it is all that reflected in the academic practice and academic research and analytical research as well in research centers and think tank. So I'm going to propose that a part of this is because our view of the dynamics of politics within the MPT draws on a very narrow conception of agency in international politics. And that agency is primarily the agency of great powers, and is primarily also linked to the origins of the treaty that is more frequently than not portrayed as the product of kind of like a great power collusion or agreement behind the doors. I mean, some of that might have happened, and great powers play a very important and key role in the treaty. But what I want to share with you is by only focusing on this, we limit our universe of possibilities and options, and perhaps also misunderstand both the origins of the treaty and its current politics. And part of this research tried to draw the attention to the role of middle powers and small powers, and how they sort of like developed positions of negotiation and influence on a global scale, whether in the MPT review conferences or in other forum. And to take it to the TPNW, you cannot really understand how the TPNW came into being and the effect that it might have without really understanding the role of middle powers, because they were actually in the driver's seat when it comes to the TPNW. But what I want to say is that they were also played a key and significant role in the MPT, whether in negotiations or in its current politics. So I share with you some of the common narratives about the MPT and how it evolved, specifically how it was negotiated. And key among them is that focus on this being a US-Soviet Union pact, bilateral superpowers affair almost entirely. The narrative sort of like draws on the situation in Europe, nuclear sharing in Europe, debate about multilateral nuclear forces in Europe, and that being when that is resolved, that's unpacked, unblocked the route towards negotiation of the treaty. It's more frequently than not also portrayed as a response either to a nuclear question in Europe. So the European theater is very very prominent, or as a response to sort of like China's nuclear test, you know, and the desire to close the door after China's nuclearization. And again, what I'm saying is that these are not factors that played no role. I think they played a key and important role. But what I'm trying to say is that this is not the only way to think about the treaty and how it evolved. In more practical terms, if you look into the negotiations of the treaty, you always find it sort of like confined at the very last bit, the late 60s, maybe from 66 to 68, and specifically chronicled by the submission of common drafts between the US and the Soviet Union, first individually, then jointly. I would also argue that a lot of this on the analytical community and in terms of research is driven by either, you know, whether that debate between realists and liberals.
Stopped. This meeting is being recorded.
Sorry about that. I'm not sure whether that came from my laptop or from someone else's, but I will carry on. So, you know, that liberal realist debate that sort of like is very prominent in international relations, obviously not the only one, but that consequential logic that ties treaties and regimes into great powers is something that both liberals and realists share. But also when you look into constructivist work, you kind of feel like it's predominantly linked to a certain kind of actors that primarily, I would say, does not include a lot of actors from the global south. And when they include middle powers, that is also kind of like, you know, European kind of like profile. So I think as a result of this, we have a very stilted view of the treaty and how it developed. When you look into actually the history of how the treaty evolved, however imperfect it is, you find that Ireland played a key role. You find like in 1964, there is an African summit that included a declaration for denuclearization. You can take the whole NAM involvement back to 1955 and the Bandung Conference. Then the NAM summit in 1964 was a big push towards sort of pushing the Treaty on Non-Proliferation negotiations, unified NAM position behind the treaty, you know, behind the process that led to the negotiation of the treaty. If you look at the indefinite extension of the NPT, there is no way you can write up that history without acknowledging the role of Canada, South Africa, and possibly also Egypt. So final thoughts from me. To understand the origins and trajectory of the NPT, you need to broaden the length and see beyond just beyond just the great power collusion or a bilateral pact into something that is bigger. I think the role of agency and conception of agency here is important, highlighting the role of other states that were parts of the treaty and continue to be key actors, and then can take the whole issue to new forums like the TPNW is really important. And here, the role is not passive acceptance or inheritance of a treaty or direct coercion, as sometimes is portrayed in the literature, but actually a full agents that situated in regional dilemmas that relate to security. And these treaties can be part of addressing that. Also, it's very important, I think, to situate the treaty into that long-standing anti-nuclear international advocacy that once you start exploring broader agency international politics, you see in Bandung, you see in all these other conferences. Right, that's it from me, and I perhaps can share more in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hassan. Very interesting remarks. Our next speaker will be Olamide Samuel.
Well, thank you, Matthew. Yeah, I don't think I'm capable of speaking as quickly as all the other experienced speakers here today, but I'll try my best. Well, thank you very much for having me. And a summary of my research, looking at the TPNW, has actually been to sort of ignore the orthodoxy of studies that is beginning to develop around the TPNW treaty process, which, you know, looks at how the treaty is a challenge to nuclear orthodoxy and how supporters are somewhat monolithic. As someone from the global South, my interest really is about looking closer at the coalitions that form the core support for the TPNW treaty and looking at the diversity of interests within that coalition. And so it's quite convenient that Hassan has highlighted, you know, the non-aligned movement in the 60s and how they were massive supporters for nuclear disarmament, and how a lot of agency from the global south is sort of overlooked when we're thinking about, the drivers for nuclear disarmament. And it really relates a lot to my research, because when I look closer at what nuclear disarmament means for states in the global south, we find a stark difference with Western states that support nuclear disarmament. So for Western states that support nuclear disarmament, we find that they are looking at the TPNW as a way to channel or to express the injustices they face in terms of their inability to extract themselves or to insulate themselves from the adverse impacts of a nuclear war or a nuclear exchange. And so these Western states, we usually see them as, the norm entrepreneurs, those that are driving positive neutrality. States which come to mind are Austria and Ireland, who, have really championed some sort of nuclear ban globally. Whereas when I look at the global south, there's a bit more diversity with regards to the sort of injustices that are being expressed by global south states. The first category of states are those that are called the retributive justice seeking states from the global south. And these are states that are very active when we talk about the humanitarian initiative and the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons. And this is precisely because many of these states have, suffered the adverse impacts of nuclear testing on their colonies, on their territories. Many of them were colonies of imperial powers when these tests were carried out. And so they see the humanitarian initiative and the TPNW as a means to, seek for some sort of retribution, seek for some sort of compensation and recognition of the harm that was caused. The other type of global south supporting state of the TPNW are those that fall under the category of distributive justice seekers. And this is where it gets quite interesting. So what we find is that distributive justice seekers are many states in the global south whose primary security concern is interlinked with their developmental concerns. They face massive economic insecurity, energy poverty, social instability. And so when they interact with global processes such as the TPNW, of course, they support nuclear disarmament because of their membership in the non-aligned movement initially, but they also see nuclear disarmament not as an end in itself, but as a stepping stone, pun intended, for development, making the world sort of safe for nuclear power. And this is where it gets quite interesting, because the distributive justice seeking states among TPNW supporters are sometimes in conflict with the positive neutrality states of the West, such as Ireland and Austria, that explicitly reject nuclear energy and nuclear power. And also sometimes in conflict with retributive justice seeking states, which have actually experienced the environmental and human damage that could be caused by the misuse of nuclear technologies. But the TPNW, at the end of the day, through the negotiation processes, was actually able to form or create consensus and focus around the primacy of nuclear disarmament as the core interests of all of these diverse states. Distributive justice-seeking states, many of which are from the global south, are mostly already members of nuclear weapons-free zones, for example. The Felindaba Treaty is just one of these examples where essentially for many African states, signing on to the TPNW doesn't really change their legal environment because they've already outlawed nuclear weapons, they've already rejected nuclear weapons possession, threats, etc. But the TPNW advocates were able to still encourage these states from the global south to support the positive neutrality looking states and the retributive justice seeking states as a way of sort of challenging nuclear orthodoxy on the condition that the TPNW was not going to interfere with their Article 4 rights in the NPT. And so when you look at the TPNW treaty text in the preamble, you actually see that there's an explicit reference to the inalienable right of states to pursue nuclear energy in a disarmament treaty. Now, at first glance, that seems out of place, but understanding these internal dynamics makes you see more clearly how this was perhaps a compromise to still get the largest number of states to support the TPNW. Another oddity, which I wouldn't get into here for reasons of time, would be the additional protocol, the joining process of the TPNW, where some call it the lowest standard is what has been accepted if you want to join the TPNW. States like Switzerland, states like Ireland, states like Austria have been looking to universalize the additional protocol as a way of ensuring that nuclear material and technology is not diverted for military purposes. And I think they saw an opportunity in the TPNW in the joining procedures to sort of enshrine this universalization of the additional protocol. But there was significant pushback to that from distributive justice-seeking states, many of whom are non-aligned movement states. If you look at the treaty text, the original draft, and the corrections that have been uploaded on the UN website, you'd see that states like Algeria, Brazil, that isn't a signatory, actually wrote comments about, the additional, wrote comments about the preamble, where they explicitly included the protection of nuclear energy in the TPNW. And these same states are states that have, in principle, rejected the universalization of the additional protocol. So in summary, when we look at the TPNW and when we look at how states are supporting nuclear disarmament, we have to understand the wider context within which these states exist, beyond just the nuclear politics realm. We have to think about their developmental concerns and also their historical inclinations towards certain types of technologies or others. And that will give you a much more comprehensive perspective of the politics that occurs and will occur within the TPNW process. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Very interesting perspective, and I like how both the two prior presentations brought in some actors who from the global South, especially, who are often neglected in scholarship, at least in the United States, on nuclear security. So that's a really good perspective to have. Next, we'll turn it over to Slav Egland.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And thank you also to Marina, Rebecca, and Stephen for making this happen. I'm very, very glad to be here. I'm going to talk not really about the TPNW today, but rather about the more general phenomenon of nuclear disarmament or nuclear relinquishment. Specifically, I'll talk a bit about, or give a kind of summary of a recent article of mine called A Theory of Nuclear Disarmament, which was published in the journal Contemporary Security Policy. It's open access, so should be available to anyone interested, and possibly there's going to be a link in the chat box as well. So in broad strokes, what I'm trying to do in the article is to ask a pretty straightforward question, namely what causes or might cause decisions to relinquish a nuclear arsenal. And importantly also, how can we adjudicate between different answers to this question? So how might a theory of nuclear disarmament or nuclear relinquishment be tested or substantiated empirically? So nuclear disarmament has provided a nominally shared goal for pretty much all the world's states for decades, at least in theory. Yet, nevertheless, surprisingly little effort has actually been devoted to systematically theorizing the drivers of nuclear disarmament or relinquishment. So my article is an attempt at beginning to fill this void or gap in the literature. And the article is divided into 3 parts. And in the first, I discuss the conceptual, material, and ideational features of nuclear disarmament or renunciation. So I'm talking here about a state's complete relinquishment or renunciation of nuclear weapons, and not just stockpile reductions. So in the first part, I discussed the conceptual, material, and ideational features of this to arrive at some rudimentary or basic understanding of what, fundamentally nuclear disarmament is or involves. Then secondly, I try to scope out and assess the empirical evidence on which a general theory of nuclear renunciation might be based. And in the third part, I try to synthesize or look at the dominant explanations that have been offered by other scholars for the cases or the candidate bodies of evidence that I discuss in the second part. So on this basis, I try to outline a very basic or first attempt at an account of nuclear relinquishment, and try to discuss this theory with and compare the compatibility of this theory with common assumptions about disarmament practice. So what diplomats are doing essentially. So there is actually very little, I would say surprisingly little, theory on nuclear disarmament or nuclear renunciation. So there is, of course, a lot of debate about strategies of disarmament, ideas about how to do it responsibly, ways out of the nuclear age, as Lawrence Friedman would say. There's much less literature on the general causes or drivers. Much of the literature on disarmament, I would say, is also very policy oriented. It's also often written by policymakers or current or former diplomats. And much of it essentially takes the talking points of governments for granted, basing the assumptions about what is possible or not possible on the formal statements of governments. I think, however, that government statements are often not totally reliable here. So in nuclear discourse, as other political discourse, statements by policymakers are often performative and meant to have an effect on the world rather than to describe the world as accurately as possible. And then lastly, there's also quite a lot of work on disarmament movements, like on the TPNW, but again, much less on the general drivers or causes of nuclear disarmament. Here we see a big contrast to fields like nuclear proliferation, where we have multiple books offering different theories that are based on empirical data and studies, standard social science work on causal questions. So you might say that one of the obvious reasons why there's less work on nuclear disarmament is because there is very little evidence to base any theory on. And this is definitely the case. This is true. Then again, this is also the case for things like nuclear escalation. And we have quite a lot of different theories about that, even though we still thankfully have not experienced the nuclear war. And I'm making the case that scarcity or paucity of evidence should be an invitation to be a little bit more creative in terms of how we understand the evidence, rather than just throwing empirical or systematic social science analysis overboard altogether. So then the main part of my article is a discussion of various candidate bodies for evidence or historical lessons or parallels that we might use to inform a theory of nuclear disarmament. So firstly, I of course discussed the case of South Africa's disarmament. Then I secondly also discussed the renunciation of nuclear weapons by the post-Soviet states of Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine. And then thirdly, I discussed non-nuclear disarmament processes. And then fourthly, bilateral nuclear arms control and stockpile limitation agreements. And then fifth, nuclear reversal processes, also known as nuclear rollback cases in countries like Sweden and Switzerland. And then finally, I also look a bit at another set of evidence that people have invoked as historical lessons in this field, which is major social movements and change, like the abolition of the slave trade. And then in assessing these bodies of evidence, I argued that processes to do with non-nuclear phenomena could actually be of some value, and perhaps even of greater value than, for example, the cases of stockpile limitations and bilateral arms control. After all, disarmament or nuclear relinquishment would necessitate the transcendence of nuclear deterrence and a confrontation with vested interests that are invested in nuclear arsenals. Arms control, however, can be done without doing any of those things. Some of you might remember, for example, that when the Obama administration negotiated the New START treaty, that was justified by the administration as an effort at strengthening nuclear deterrence rather than overcoming it. I think it's really important to have research on these very important topics. So I'm really grateful for this event, and thank you for having me. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Okay, our sixth and final speaker for now will be Tamara Patton.
Great, thank you so much. Can you all hear me and see the slides? Perfect. So thank you again to the organizers for having me. I was asked to focus on disarmament verification. My remarks draw from a paper that I co-authored with Zia Mian and Sebastian Philippe at Princeton, which I believe will be shared in the chat. So I'll start off by saying that I agree with those who have pointed out that the TPNW has not changed much in terms of the long-standing questions surrounding nuclear disarmament and its verification. What I do think is that the treaty has sharpened the focus on some existing questions in ways that are very relevant to the study of disarmament verification specifically, and to international cooperation more broadly. So for the sake of time, I'm going to focus on one such example, which is the way that the TPNW frames disarmament, not just in terms of the weapons, but in terms of a program. The treaty takes the perspective that a nuclear weapon program comprises production, maintenance, and modernization. And in Article 4, it calls for states to submit a plan for the verified and irreversible elimination of that program. So what does that mean in practice? How far are we in understanding and deciding on the scope of a nuclear weapon program? So if we begin with precedent, and I apologize if this is difficult to read, but this is essentially an aggregation of all nuclear weapon related activities and facilities as mentioned in IAEA documentation and in relevant nuclear treaties. Whether all of this would need to be addressed and how is certainly one set of questions, but I think another question is what verification experience do we have across this landscape at the international level to draw upon? So to offer the beginnings of an answer, here is one perspective on elements of a nuclear weapon program, which draws from this helpful report from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. So their simplified framework covers the key areas of the fuel cycle, weaponization, delivery, and militarization. So just to run through a couple of examples to give an idea here. If you look at IAEA reporting on North Korea prior to its withdrawal from the NPT, this is what the scope of verification looked like. You can see the focus was almost entirely on the civilian fuel cycle with a view to preventing diversion for weapon purposes. In the case of South Africa's former nuclear weapon program, you can see the IAEA's inspections moved into weaponization and militarization in some areas, but verification was still pretty limited in scope because South Africa had not yet progressed to integrating the weapon into its force structure. In the case of Iran, the IEA also dealt with some military facilities, but these were organized through ad hoc agreements rather than on the basis of a more broadly agreed systematic approach. So with these quick case overviews, I think the uncharted territory in terms of international verification experience becomes a bit clearer. Further, what has worked in the past for nascent nuclear weapon programs will not necessarily translate to states with much older, much larger, or more diverse nuclear weapon programs and much bigger material balance uncertainties. So in the paper I shared, we make the case that there exists both a technical and procedural gap, as well as an institutional gap when it comes to nuclear disarmament and verification, and an area where the TPNW might be positioned to assist with. So looking ahead, disarmament verification research is, of course, clearly still very active through organizations like UNIDIR, IPNDV, many technical programs within universities and through NGOs. From these groups, we see a lot of workable ideas from how to get from point A with a warhead, navigate a chain of knowledge and end up at point B, which could be, disposed nuclear waste or other debated alternatives. There's also a lot of great work on leveraging commercial remote sensing technologies in ways that balance effectiveness with non-intrusiveness. But what we're not necessarily seeing a great deal of is this interrogation of the scope of a nuclear weapon program and how these proposed procedures either will or won't work for this much broader array of infrastructure that we're talking about. Which might, in addition to the list I showed you, include things not tied to any physical location, such as scientists, training, funding, research and development streams. So my co-authors and I have been among those that see these knowledge gaps as benefiting from an ongoing process of scientific and technical consultation and advising. Again, not because we don't have answers on disarmament verification. There are a lot of answers and proposals, but rather for organizing and applying the work that's been done across these different contexts, depending on how a nuclear weapon program is delimited. So if the TPNW does include a scientific advising mechanism as part of its work, this would be something to watch closely. And perhaps in parallel, academics might deepen work on the question of what is the role of scientific and technical advising on verification in shaping things like disarmament norms and practices. And finally, I think future research could usefully examine intersections with the literature on international cooperation. With the concept of reciprocity, for example, states might see value in a more comprehensive definition of a nuclear weapon program if their adversary is also adopting that definition and implementing that definition. In general, I see this as very much linked not only with verification, but also with questions of reversibility and irreversibility and the sustainability of nuclear disarmament, both through a technological and institutional lens. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much for your time.
Great, excellent and concise comments. Thank you. In a few moments, we're going to open the floor for questions from the audience members. And for that, we will call on you and have you ask your question. We'll need to give you the capability to be able to speak, but we'll do that when you're called on. And for that purpose, please use the chat function in Zoom. The hand raise function in Zoom, so we can get a queue going with questions. Be thinking about questions you might want to ask now. In the short term, I'm going to kick things off and use my role as moderator to ask a few broad questions for the panelists to respond to. And in doing so, I'm going to intentionally be a little provocative in the spirit of fostering conversation. So the questions that I'm asking do not necessarily reflect my own views or views that come from my research, but are rather meant to stimulate your responses. So let me just begin with a perspective about nuclear disarmament that is pretty cynical or skeptical, which would hold that in today's environment, where you have countries like North Korea building and threatening to use nuclear weapons in a bellicose manner. In addition, you have Russia under Vladimir Putin invading Ukraine and then using nuclear threats quite explicitly to deter third-party intervention by the United States or others. And so in this kind of international environment where nuclear weapons seem very much front and center, I wonder how we think about, from a scholarly standpoint, the issue of nuclear disarmament. Right when the Cold War ended, there was, I think, more optimism about nuclear disarmament, and therefore good work done in the academy, looking at things like virtual nuclear arsenals, for example. But now the environment is different as new nuclear threats have emerged. And so I wonder if some or all of you could comment on how you think about approaching your research in that kind of environment we're facing in the real world.
I'll take a go at it. Might as well. And that is, one of the things that I think we see right now is increasing polarization, because I do think you have, Matt, you've mentioned something which is deeply concerning, that I think that, a lot of countries in the age of great power competition, which is increasing, are going to see nuclear weapons as being more useful as far as modernizing arsenals. And I think as well, there will be cases where countries will now be interested, right, in obtaining a nuclear umbrella or even considering proliferation in some way. And in my view, perhaps, I think that some states may see what happened to Saddam and Gaddafi, and then see Ukraine, which disarmed, and then take this as another data point that nuclear weapons are a guarantor of national sovereignty. But I also think that it is going the other way. And with the first conference of the states parties on the TPNW coming up, I think that we see lots of countries and states and individuals that are pushing in a direction in which they see a potential confrontation between the United States, NATO, and Russia as being a reason for the TPNW. So it kind of supercharges their advocacy and their interest in joining the TPNW. So what I would say is, looking at public opinion itself, I see that there are a number of debates that are going to be coming in the future years. And I think that the TPNW may grow more appealing in certain countries and certain security environments who are horrified by what they see going on. And I think that there will also probably be some political parties along the left-wing spectrum within NATO or countries under the US nuclear umbrella who are going to take that opposite lesson. And so I see the polarization that is coming and is arising with the conflict in Ukraine as being another reason why, if you are interested in public opinion on the TPNW, to continue measuring these types of things. Because I think what we're seeing right now, as far as the challenges to the global nuclear order, there's going to be more discussions within NATO, more discussion elsewhere. And if certain countries within NATO or certain countries under the US nuclear umbrella, their domestic political factions are interested in taking on the TPNW, that has implications, of course, for alliance politics and extended deterrence and other things. So I think that, for me at least, it's a continuing reason. It makes it even more important to really keep an eye on what publics think about nuclear weapons in general and disarmament.
Great. Would anyone else like to take a stab at that broad question?
I'm happy to speak, but I want to give other people a shot first. Nobody? Okay. Just a really brief comment. I want to say, because I've examined the rhetoric coming from this, the security rhetoric on one side that says we need these, but on the TPNW side, if you listen to some of the diplomats from leaders in that movement, they will say that they are making a security calculation and that they are being realistic. And so you have now both sides saying that they're the ones examining the world and taking the realistic look and saying that we've made a security calculation that the world is more secure without nuclear weapons. And so I thought it was interesting, Matt, that you just used the word real world, because we seem to be having a contest over who's more in reality, the people against nuclear weapons or the people for nuclear deterrence, I should say. I also think we've seen in the immediate aftermath of what's happened in Ukraine, fear amongst the public, and that has led, there's all these stories about Europe and iodine pills and maybe more support for nuclear deterrence. But I wonder that as that fear dissipates, people will say, well, maybe someone like Putin shouldn't have nuclear weapons. And how would you get to that state where he doesn't? Well, you probably need some sort of multilateral disarmament process. So I will pass it on to Hassan, who I think was next.
Great, thanks. Yes, and I would also add to what Rebecca and Stephen mentioned, and I agree with what they both said, that this is a long-term issue and problem that the analytical community has been engaging with, and those interested in nuclear politics have been thinking about this for such a long period of time. I think since basically the nuclear weapons came into existence, thinking about how to actually control it, get rid of it perhaps, started. And I think we limit ourselves too much by just also following the news cycle of what's, the conclusions from what's happening in Ukraine might change tomorrow. We might find ourselves in a very different place next week. We might find ourselves much closer to nuclear disarmament, under some of these scenarios that are currently being discussed in Ukraine. And we might find ourselves in a different place. But I think what would remain is that this is a long-term issue and requires some long-term thinking. And that some of us are engaged in that long-term thinking, I think is a good thing.
Tamara?
Thanks. Just to build on what others have been saying with, the environment becoming more dangerous, essentially for some increasing, the impetus for nuclear disarmament rather than decreasing it. And just since I'm the little voice of verification on this panel, I can say that, as one, yes, the militarization side of things and the tensions have certainly increased in one respect. But something that has also changed is our verification capabilities in terms of their availability, their quality, their accessibility. And so it's, it's an asset I certainly think deserves to be part of the conversation. And I'll invoke Jonathan Schell here, who, back in the 80s was saying that, deterrence for those who want to hold on to it can exist in many different forms. But rather than having weapon deterring weapon in a disarmed world, with the support of a verification system, you would have factory deterring factory and blueprint deterring blueprint, and you would have much longer lead times for decision making in the event of a defection or a crisis. So it's really, there are multiple approaches and multiple ways to answer this question. But I think starting with looking at how, we reframe some of this is a starting point.
Shulv, did you want to take a shot at this as well?
Yes, please. I think I would struggle to add to what my fellow panelists have already said in response to your direct question. So perhaps I'll try to answer a slightly different question, or rather just to speculate a bit, because I do agree with you that the security environment now clearly looks quite difficult for nuclear disarmament. I think increases in tension often serve to reinforce or strengthen status quo thinking in security policy. But there could be, at least hopefully, an after this current increase in tension, right? So my question would be, what happens after that if we do get a new post Cold War period, or whatever it will be after a post Cold War period, after the current the current Cold War that we seem to be on our way into right now. And I just say one thing, which is that I think right now the Russian state and Mr. Putin himself are now so closely associated with nuclear weapons and nuclearism, if you will, that I think almost any effort at creating a new Russia from the ashes of this current installation would almost have to be non-nuclear or anti-nuclear in a way, if they wanted to create a genuine democratic alternative. Because I think if we look at what happened in the other post-Soviet states after 1991, I think you saw quite clearly in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus that in all of those countries, going non-nuclear and anti-nuclear became a pretty important way of distinguishing themselves from their Soviet past, from Moscow, and creating new national identities as newly independent states. So I think that's something quite interesting to think about, how something similar to that might happen in the future in a country like Russia now. Maybe it's highly speculative, I know, but maybe something to think about.
Great, thank you. Olamide.
Yeah, I just found Shov's response very interesting, and this is no response of my own. I'm just adding to perhaps the evidence of a change of guard, welcoming a change in nuclear stance. It's interesting that this is what happened in post-apartheid South Africa, where the Black liberation movements in the Southern African region were so against the concept of a very aggressive national security posture that the apartheid government deployed, that Black liberation became intertwined with nuclear disarmament. And even though there were some members of the ANC that saw some strategic benefit in perhaps retaining South Africa's nuclear weapons, it was already a bit too late to change such a discourse. So yeah, it might sound pie in the sky, but it actually has precedent.
Great. Thank you all for those interesting responses. I want to pivot a little bit and ask another broad question before opening it up to the other audience members, which has to do with another kind of tool in the non-proliferation toolkit dealing with non-proliferation and disarmament. And that is nuclear weapons free zone treaties, which are regional treaties that denuclearize particular regions of the world. Many of you all had interesting things to say about the TPNW and also the NPT, but I didn't hear much about nuclear weapons free zone treaties, which apply to almost all of the global South. These treaties tended to emerge out of some kind of nuclear trauma. So for example, the Treaty of Tlatelolco in Latin America was set up after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Some of the others were in response to nuclear testing by France, for example, in the Pacific, South Pacific regions, and the UK as well. And so I wonder if any of you all have looked into this in your research as another part of history that we might think about to gain leverage on the broader question of nuclear disarmament, or at least arms control. Does anyone have any thoughts about that come out of their work?
I'll just jump in. I noticed
go ahead.
Matt's microphone is on mute. Yeah, I've come across very interesting things about nuclear weapons-free zones, looking specifically at Africa, but there is some interesting work by a colleague called Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh, who looks at the entirety of nuclear weapons-free zone dynamics within a concept called obedient rebellion. The African nuclear weapons-free zone case is quite interesting because it was, of course, born out of some sort of trauma. In the Sahara. So more generally speaking, nuclear weapons-free zones born out of these traumas have over time limited at least the spatial reach of nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence relationships. So, you know, we found treaties that limited nuclear testing in the Antarctic, and all of a sudden now we had, you know, nuclear weapons banned in South America and in Africa. And it seems as though the TPNW is almost a logical continuation of that, where the last region without a comprehensive nuclear weapons free zone treaty is now sort of the target for states that have already implemented or have already declared themselves nuclear free states, trying to increase that buffer zone geographically. So there's almost an evolution where we're seeing the space within which nuclear weapons can be used becoming less and less. Back to the South African nuclear weapon free zone treaty, it's also interesting that the protocols of these treaties routinely call on former colonial powers or, you know, extra-continental states that have territories within a particular region to sign on to that treaty, right? So in some way, they're directly also limiting the reach and the ability of nuclear weapon states to, for example, deploy some sort of nuclear deterrent within the African continental zone. So it's an interesting evolution. I'll pause here for now.
Great, thanks. At this point, I think I want to open the questions to the audience members, and I have other things I'd like to ask, but I'll hold off and see if there's time at the end of our discussion here. So again, if you'd like to ask a question, please use the hand raise feature in Zoom. If you type something in the chat, it's possible I might miss that due to the volume of things coming in there. So please use the hand raise function, and then we'll call on you to ask your question. The first person I see in the queue is Benoit Pelopidas.
Hello, so can you hear? Should I activate something or can I just speak like now?
We can hear you just fine.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, sorry for being awkward. Thank you to all of you for doing this work. I'm gonna be kind of short and build on the fact that what I've heard today essentially is trying to escape presentism. And so I'm going to build on mostly what Hassan said on taking the long-term view and what Shelf said in terms of the post-current mess, to ask you one question, which is, so the future you have in mind when you think about the processes towards nuclear weapons policy change, how does climate change feature in those, if at all? That's my question.
Do you want to collect questions or should we?
I think, why doesn't someone respond right after a question comes in?
I mean, I'm happy to say something quickly, and then if someone wants to add. I mean, one thing that I think is going to happen is it's not just environmental norms that are going to intersect with nuclear disarmament norms. I think growing norms about justice and fairness in the international system that we see emerging and becoming stronger. And I think the TPNW represents that in some ways. I think it's possible that all of those norms intersect and that you do get communities who really care about the environment, seeing how, you know, nuclear weapons can bring such environmental devastation. On that topic, if you're interested in this topic and you haven't read Walter Pincus's book Fallout, which looks at the Marshall Islands and just really captures the environmental devastation of nuclear weapons well, I recommend that. And so I think as we have more intersectionality of these norms, then it's a potential to kind of be a more powerful voice in thinking about nuclear disarmament.
Okay, Hassan, and then Olamide.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think we're perhaps a lot of times concerned about sort of unblocking the way to imagining a different future than actually imagining that that future. And certainly, you know, what the world with climate change would look like is a big question, and there's I think very little written on that. But as you were asking that question, Benoit, what quickly came to my mind is that also the way that climate emergency is being handled is perhaps can either be a positive thing or a negative thing on how the nuclear question is handled. So in a sense, if we emerge from addressing the climate with kind of like global mechanisms that can address this in a sort of like in an effective way, that perhaps that can go some way into convincing other skeptical voices that sort of like, you know, some level of international structure is perhaps credible and doable. And in that way, it can be a catalyst.
I'll just jump right in after Hassan, if that's okay. The question, in its simplicity, really sort of obscured a very, very complicated discussion. So the relationship between, you know, imagining a future without nuclear weapons, but one within which climate change and the climate emergency is reliably, you know, dealt with, is multifaceted, because on the one hand, you know, depending on what sort of nuclear technology you're looking at, there's an inverse relationship. So when you think about the relationship between, say, nuclear weapons and the system of nuclear deterrence and a worsening climate and environment, there's been some interesting studies that show, for example, just how certain deployed nuclear weapons installations are susceptible to the negative impacts of climate change, and just how, you know, how unprepared many nuclear weapon states have been to deal with such emergencies, rising coastline levels, etc. So we have a very unstable world if we're facing a world within which, you know, the Earth is unstable, and then nuclear installations are also much more dangerous when we think about nuclear weapons. An inverse relationship is exposed when we talk about nuclear energy and nuclear technologies, where there are many advocates supported by the IAEA that have started sort of really championing nuclear energy as the solution to still enable simultaneous development in energy poverty regions, while still having, you know, low carbon emissions. This is a trend that was really, really exposed in COP26, and I would suspect it will be repeated in COP27. And these discussions completely ignore, of course, the associated dangers with nuclear technologies, human and environmental dangers. But they also ignore something that has been left unattended in the nuclear non-proliferation disarmament space. And that is the issue of, if you have many more nuclear energy installations, as we saw in Ukraine, they could sometimes be targets of conventional attacks. If they are targets of conventional attacks, what does that mean for human and environmental safety? And the legal question on the protection of nuclear power plants has still been left unanswered. I think Sweden raised it in the CD in 1980. A couple of countries have raised it ever since then. Africa sort of did its own thing and enshrined the protection of power plants in Article 11 of the Pelindaba Treaty. But at a global level, it's an unanswered question. So when you couple the increased focus on nuclear energy and the potential for more installations to be erected and the lack of legal protections, we're going to still be facing a very unstable, perhaps insecure future. I'll pause there. Thank you.
Okay, let's take one more response to this question, and that will be Shalab.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for a predictably good question, Benoit. I think for me, one of the most obvious ways in which the climate crisis could impact debates on nuclear disarmament would be that the climate crisis is going to, or solving the climate crisis and solving all the various consequences of the climate crisis is going to demand a lot of resources. And currently quite a lot of resources is going into producing and maintaining nuclear weapons. So you could quite easily see this strengthening the argument that we need the resources that are currently going into nuclear weapons for other things, which might strengthen the case for nuclear disarmament. I think I checked these numbers a few months ago, and I may be misremembering, so take this with a pinch of salt, but if I remember correctly, I think the Biden administration is spending about twice as much over the next 10 years on nuclear weapons as on electric vehicle infrastructure and rail combined. So, you know, there is probably an argument there. But you could easily also see the argument being made that we are now heading into a dark and dangerous climate future with more security competition and competition for resources. And in this brave new world, we're going to need nuclear weapons for deterrence. So I think which of those narratives win out is obviously going to be impacted by political and cultural factors. I think more broadly, though, there's been quite a lot of literature produced, over the last 10 or so years on the security implications of climate change. There's been far less research, however, on the climate consequences of alternative approaches to security. And that, I think, is something that we might look more into in the future. You know, different military postures and defense policies and nuclear weapons policies, of course, are an important part of that, have different implications or carbon footprints associated with them, including in terms of how likely they are to help or hinder cooperation on climate solutions in the future.
Great, thank you. Let me go now to our next question from the audience, and that will be from Edwin Kindler.
Hello, thank you very much. So my question is about verification. So inherently, I think for Dr. Patton, but also for anyone else who wishes to answer it. What's the kind of forward outlook or scholarship on the role of states without nuclear weapons in nuclear disarmament verification? As inherently kind of with the TPNW discussion, states without nuclear weapons are kind of driving a lot of this. How can, what's the current outlook for how states can be involved in this process for their satisfaction as disarmament goes on, and then without kind of affecting their Article 2 responsibilities under the NPT?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. I think the answer gets in one respect down to the technologies themselves and in another to the broader approaches. So I'll start with the technologies. But a number of different organizations, universities have developed ways for non-nuclear weapon states to participate in this process, theoretically on the basis of masking signatures of nuclear weapons through a number of different approaches, information barriers, you may have heard of them. And, there's obviously a big body of work that surrounds that, from, the architecture of chain of knowledge and how these different technologies come into play at different parts in the process. But a number of the really early exercises involved non-nuclear weapon state participants. Hassan and Verdict were among the pioneers in that area with the UK-Norway initiative. So there's certainly been, a lot of thinking and practice about how to involve non-nuclear weapon states. There are also a lot proposals for sort of broader approaches to basically not having to ever deal with the sensitive information. UNIDIR has proposed, for example, an approach based on verifying the absence of nuclear weapons. So essentially, under that framework, it would be up to the state to dismantle its weapons, engage in a process of fissile material accountancy in a non-classified form. And then afterward, it would really just be about going into these facilities and, through a structured inspection approach, a number of which they have proposed, verify that there are no longer any nuclear weapons or, radioactive material in these storage sites, in these, bases, maintenance sites, procurement sites. Again, you saw the very long list of facilities, but essentially that approach is one that non-nuclear weapon states could very much be involved in. But again, it would be a process of negotiation with the state that has decided to disarm. And again, that process for how that negotiation and engagement would take place with the states parties of the TPNW is laid out in that treaty. If anyone else wants to chime in, feel free.
Thank you. Let's go to our next question, which will be from David Allison.
Hi. So my question follows along the same line, which is very convenient. It's also for Tamer. And what I'm wondering is, it seems to me that there are sort of two discrete verification challenges to think about when it comes to total disarmament. The first one is technological, which I think you addressed really nicely. But the second one is psychological or sociological. And that is how we convince suspicious, fearful humans who are bad at rationally assessing extremely low probability events that there really are no nuclear weapons left, right? I mean, I think if you go and you speak to policymakers and, you go talk to sort of, Air Force generals and say, like, what would you need to see to believe that the Russians have really given up all their nuclear weapons? The answer is like omniscience. And so my question is, can this be overcome? Do we know how to design institutions to reduce uncertainty this far? And if so, like, what can we as a scholarly community do to move in that direction? Thanks.
Thanks for the question. It's certainly a big one. But I think, obviously, no verification system is ever going to be perfect. No verification system with the best technology, the best institutions, the best approaches is never going to give you 100% certainty that there are no nuclear weapons at all in the world. That is a fair point. But I think in terms of, what you're asking, communicating to the public why this might still be a viable approach, gets into communicating some of the realities of what it takes to produce a nuclear weapon and a nuclear weapon program in broad and easy to digest terms. The fact that, nuclear weapons require huge amounts of infrastructure in order to mine, refine, convert, enrich, reprocess the material we've seen states in the past try to hide these facilities unsuccessfully underground. It's, the realities of what it takes to run these things come with, the massive amount of electrical infrastructure that make them very hard to hide, the massive amount of cooling infrastructure needed that make them very hard to hide. So I think that's part of the answer is communicating that nuclear weapon programs are very visible. And the other part is, I think, communicating that what I think we're really talking about is in terms of what matters at the end of the day, and this is, I hate to borrow this term from, the 80s in the US, but they would always talk about what matters in terms of verification is a capability of military significance. So, in negotiating for the INF, where there was all of these same questions, there can never be, 100% certainty that all intermediate range nuclear weapons have been dismantled. That treaty was fought for on the basis of the argument that, we will be able to see at least any capability that matters on a military level. So I think that's not a complete answer to your question, but I hope it's a start, that it is a lot of taking some complexities and realities about the technology and communicating them in a way that is clear and effective.
Hassan, would you like to respond to this as well?
Yeah, very quickly, and just to add to what Tamara mentioned, is that we currently don't have the institutional infrastructure, you can call it, that practices, internationally accepted practices that would make this this possible. I mean, I think the clearest example is all the disagreements about chemical weapons use in Syria, for example. If you look into the politics of OPCW, you'll find that the bar and the standards of evidence actually also vary significantly between different actors. And in addition to all the technical solutions that are very, very important, I think we also need to think about institutional setup and institutional infrastructure, international organizations, standards of proof and standards of evidence. And I think this can only be like a long-term, long game effort. I think the more we have, the more verification is done, the more there are actually controversies around verification that get resolved, hopefully, the more we have, cumulative experience of how to address this difficult question. But I think ultimately it would be also a question about who to include and who to not include in this, because I don't think any verification outcome can be satisfactory to everyone. So ultimately also there will be a question of judgment, hard question of judgment, about how to define acceptable standards of proof and evidence. And these are very difficult questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Let's go to our next question now from Christine Rostampour.
Hi, thank you so much for all of your insight and for organizing this panel. My question is about other multilateral non-proliferation agreements, such as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action between Iran and the P5+1. What are the impacts of these pacts being violated or being torn apart on attempts to gain support for the nuclear ban treaty and nuclear disarmament at large, especially because now there are talks coming from Iran about possibly Iran leaving the NPT? Thank you so much.
Does anyone want to take a first cut at that big question? Go ahead, Shalab.
Thanks. Again, a really good question, and I don't think I'll be able to answer it exhaustively, but I think it could have quite contradictory effects. So on the one hand, it shows that multilateral non-proliferation and disarmament work is really difficult. And specifically when you look at the US, it can be quite difficult to get treaties through the Senate. And that clearly is, given that the United States is such a powerful actor in the international system, it is something that other states really have to think quite carefully about. On the other hand, though, I think the kind of collapse of the JCPOA also, to some states, will be seen as yet more evidence that the traditional way of doing things, the traditional way of doing non-proliferation and disarmament isn't really working, and that this approach where you have a relatively small circle of great powers having all the agency and telling other countries what to do or not do with nuclear technology is perhaps not as effective as we might hope it would be, and that perhaps we need a new approach. This could lend itself to arguments in favor of the TPNW, the ban treaty, and a kind of paradigm shift in terms of how we think about nuclear weapons and the role of nuclear weapons in the world. More broadly, perhaps that other states, the large number of non-nuclear weapon states should also have a role in pushing for these agreements and being involved in these agreements rather than having these smaller circles of states negotiating between themselves.
Very good, thanks. Let me go now to Tom Sauer, who has our next question.
For Stefan, it's a classic question about the survey research. You measured the direction of the opinion, pro or against. That's one dimension, but another dimension is the intensity of the opinion. How thick, how thin are these opinions, pro or against? It's not because the Japanese people are against nuclear weapons that they will make it a priority when they vote. So my question, did you also study the intensity of the opinion?
Thanks very much for your question, Tom. I think that this is one of these things that comes up rather frequently. And I would, for example, draw attention to Benoit Pelopidas, who is on the call, who has a study. And one of the things that Benoit has done in some of his studies among European publics is he has found that even though European publics tend to be very anti-nuclear in some senses, when given a list of different reasons and different things that may motivate them and kind of the, where do they prioritize nuclear weapons among other issues, what we actually find is, and other studies have shown this too, is that nuclear weapons tend to rank as, you give someone 10 things, 8 considerations, and people will tell you, I have a strong opinion about nuclear weapons. People will tell you that I oppose the TPNW or I support the TPNW, but then you give them a list of other questions related to, things about putting food on the table, economic interest, and what do you see? What you see is that generally in the past, even though people have opinions about nuclear weapons have been a very low salience issue. And I think there are reasons why these have been a low salience issue. And I think that this is, something which we've seen, this kind of production of low nuclear salience has taken place in the post-Cold War era. But what I would say is, I think that things are about to change on some level. And I don't mean it's going to be a huge or massive shift, and maybe we're embedded in our own scholarly bubbles thinking about it. But I think that one of the things that we're seeing right now is I think that what Russia has done is it has, in many ways, increased the salience of nuclear weapons. And what Russia has done is by threatening other countries with nuclear weapons, by using nuclear weapons as a shield for deterrence and grievous war crimes, what Russia has done in many ways, I think, has exposed the facade of durable institutions and structures, which may be seen as pretty unsavory, this idea of nuclear targeting and deterrence and other things. So 100% I agree with you. And I think that, there's something to be said about our public opinion polling about the TPNW. And yes, people have strong opinions, but will it actually affect their votes? So I don't know if it will actually affect their votes. I do know that there's good scholarship out there that shows that both military leaders and public officials do take into consideration the perspectives of the public. However, all that said, I think it remains unclear what the future direction is of nuclear salience given the conflict in Ukraine. And I think it's going to increase. That's just my personal opinion. Thanks.
Great. Let me go now to Sophia Wallman, who has a question.
Greetings. Thank you all so much. In part responding to Dr. Samuel's observations connecting nuclear disarmament and the construction of national identities, as well as Black liberation at that time, and the analysis of retributive and distributive justice motivating states parties to the TPNW. I'm wondering if you can speak to kind of an approach of restorative justice, but I think that's part of the retributive justice model you were describing, but really that pushes into profound questions about power dynamics. Nuclear weapons are an integral part of imposing economic and political status quo globally. And so given the silence, both in the media, but also in scholarship, well, not silence because of us here, but in the US around nuclear disarmament, when there's silence in these spaces, I think it's usually serving to protect institutions like of neoliberal capitalism that are inseparable from the legacy of colonization. So I'm wondering if you can speak to that based on your research or if others can. I hope that question is a question that's clear enough. Thank you.
Great.
Yes,
Who would
it's
like to answer that? Yeah, go ahead, Olamide.
Oh, yes. It's a clear question. It's also a big question. I can respond to portions of it because I suspect that certain portions of it are sort of deeply related to US domestic politics and the interaction between especially indigenous peoples and the nuclear establishment there. The part I can speak to is, at least at the system level, at the global level, there definitely is and has been a connection between nuclear weapons possession and ideas of imperialism. In the sense that, you know, after the sort of US-Russia moment of US-Soviet Union moment of being the only states with a nuclear weapons capability, we saw that, you know, France and the UK followed suit to attempt to procure a nuclear weapons capability. And especially in the UK's case, some of the justification being made then was that nuclear weapons would serve as a way to enable the Great Britain to continue to act as a superpower. Albeit a receding superpower, given their conventional inferiority. So there's always been this connection with nuclear weapons given, you know, geographically small states, much larger geopolitical reach. An interesting sort of example today is Iran. Even just in its pursuit of nuclear weapons, even just in its alleged pursuit of nuclear weapons, it still has massively disproportionate amounts of attention given to it. It has, you know, much bigger leeway at the global stage where it can, you know, carry out actions or just turn off cameras and have this significant impact on public opinion. So there's that link. Another link again between nuclear weapons and imperialism is, of course, how nuclear weapons have been developed over time, especially when we think about nuclear testing. There's clear evidence to show that, you know, many of these then imperial powers in testing the nuclear weapons decided to utilize spaces that were far away from the, you know, metropole. So France testing in Algeria, France testing everywhere else as far as it was away from Paris. You know, the UK doing the same thing in Australia, the US doing this in Pacific Islands. It just shows that there's been a sort of deprioritization of essentially non-white bodies when we think about where is an appropriate site to test and whose opinions should we count or discount when we make the decision to test nuclear weapons. I can go on and on about this. There's a great book by Vincent Ntundi who looks at, you know, the African-American movement against the nuclear bomb, and he does have some good sections that talks about colonialism, but there's also some extensive sections on the domestic US policy relationship to this global dynamic. I'll pause here and pass on the mic.
Excellent, thank you. So we have time for 2 more questions. First, I'll call on Roger Slattery, and then I'm gonna turn it over to Francesca.
Thank you. My question is concerning the production of new knowledge in this field. I'm I'm a layperson, just interested because I'm a civilian target here in Northern California. But I'm impressed with the knowledge of this panel. It's amazing. But I'm wondering about the funding, the adequacy of funding in this field, specifically focusing on nuclear disarmament, whether it's adequate and what kind of trend do you see in it? That's it.
Shlav, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks again for the question. I think this is really, really a crucial question right now. There's been some changes in the funding landscape for nuclear policy studies generally recently, with the MacArthur Foundation pulling out or will soon pull out of the field, which was one of the major funders of work in this field. So of course you have traditional research being done at universities, which all have their own different and varied sources of funding, but then you also have the more policy relevant stuff, which usually, or at least often, happens within think tanks. And I've actually done a research project on the funding of think tanks, and turns out that quite a lot of the funding comes from actors with interests in, shall we say, the existing nuclear order. So there's quite a lot of funding in the top foreign policy think tanks, not just in the US, but all around the world, from the companies that produce nuclear weapon systems, and of course governments that base their policies, their security policies, on nuclear deterrence. And that the overall volume of that funding really far outweighs the funding that you can get from, shall we say, pro-disarmament actors. And I think this is important, and I think this does have an effect. We know from essentially, maybe not every other, but many other fields, that what we might call stakeholder funding does impact the research outputs in different ways. You know, one of the most important mechanisms, I think, isn't necessarily censorship or self-censorship, although that can also happen. Another problem is sort of the platforming of which topics and agendas are given attention in the first place, and which questions are being asked in the first place, which of course is something that the funders of research and policy relevant research can control to quite a significant degree. But I think there are lots of really important and good questions that urgently need attention and more research in this field. So and I think staying clear of conflicts of interest could be quite important. At my program, the nucleanologist program at Sciences Po in Paris, we make a thing out of our refusal of funding from actors with interests in the questions that we study, and we think we have done some good stuff in this field in recent years on the role of luck in nuclear deterrence and the nuclear order, for example, and on the inconsistencies between declared policies and actual events on the ground within the nuclear policy field. So yeah, I'm going on. I'll leave the floor to someone else. Thanks.
Great. Why don't I turn things over to Francesca at this time?
Thank you so much, guys. This was absolutely great, and I'm so happy Harvard hosted this. I have a final question for all of you, and I see on the call Zia and a few others, Tom and others, who have thought a lot about these issues. So 2 weeks ago, Livermore hosted a nuclear deterrence symposium, where none of the attendees that we had today on this event overlap with the attendees of 2 weeks ago events. They were completely different communities, separated from language, vision, worldviews, values, principles, anything. And while we're here talking about nuclear disarmament, others in that community are asking, what are the future nuclear capabilities, not even the current ones, but what are the future capabilities 45 years down the line that we would need to confront adversaries? And my impression is that the nuclear disarmament window is really closing down for one reason. The US is embarking in a major modernization process, millions and millions and millions of dollars. They are not going to do it so that in 10 years from now, they can debunk everything and just pack their way and go, right? So the idea is this is going to be a 50 years, 100 years down the line. But my question as academics is the following. These communities don't speak to one another. So I know there are some attempts in the arms control risk reduction strategies, but I have a obvious question, which is, should we try to speak together? What are the channels that need to be created so that we really speak and present and we are taken credibly on both sides of the aisle? Or do you think that more or less the train is gone and we shouldn't even try to connect with that community because they just fundamentally think about the world very differently? So I would like to hear your views on this and where are some of the opportunities to link up with that community, if at all?
And let me just add to that, because I want to give each panelist around 1 minute or so to make any closing remarks that they would like. So during your time, feel free to answer Francesca's question or to make any other closing remarks you'd like to wrap up the panel. So why don't we start with Rebecca Gibbons?
Francesca, that, as you know, is a really hard question that we are grappling with. I mean, I would say that as someone who studies the TPNW, I do regularly get to speak with the deterrence community, but it can be a hard place to feel like you're in the middle of, you're not truly in one or the other. And so are you legitimate in either one? But I do try hard to kind of talk to people in the deterrence world about the perspective of people who want to ban nuclear weapons, of acknowledging that when you're talking about nuclear weapons, you're talking about something that it goes beyond borders and could affect many different countries. And so trying to make the argument that whether you're going to agree or not, that people have a right to be at the table to talk about such an existential threat, right? It's not fair and it's not right for the P5 to say, we're the only ones who sit at this table, you don't know anything about it. And that's why I think the humanitarian movement was so useful, in that it did have this function to educate diplomats from non-nuclear weapon states who don't deal with this in their day-to-day lives. So I think, I mean, part of it is we all, public, elite, government, academia, like we all need to be more educated about nuclear weapons, and we need to have a goal of, I think, talking more about nuclear weapons and their effects and what the different arguments are on either side. So I don't want to be so pessimistic to say to give up, but I do think on the extremes of this spectrum, it is very difficult. You know, because like I said, I think earlier, maybe it was to Matt's question, one side sees nuclear weapons as providing security and one side sees nuclear weapons as undermining security. So they see the same object with opposite effects, which is quite difficult to bring them together.
Thanks. And I'm going to go in the order in which you all initially presented. So that means, Stephen, you have the floor.
Yeah, I like the kind of the comment that Rebecca made about one side sees them as providing security and the other side sees them as not providing security. And I think that when we talk about the idea of bringing people who are advocates of deterrence and disarmament together, I think it's, you know, perhaps even more stark than that, where you have one side that has gone in a direction now where a lot of the rhetoric is about how nuclear weapons are weapons of mass murder and this is immoral, and some of the people who are involved in the deterrence mission and nuclear targeting are perpetuating murder. And then on the other side, you have people who say these people have never had security clearances, they're naive, they don't know what they're talking about, these are, you know, and so I think it's a really damaging and kind of toxic stew of events. It's toxic stew to kind of find that middle ground. And My personal view on this, and that is that we need to find, as terrible as it is, as difficult as these conversations may be, is we need to actually find funding from places and opportunities to get these people in the same room and to get them to have interesting conversations. And I know that a number of people, on this call probably know that Rebecca Hassan and I are the co-chairs of Managing the Atoms Beyond Nuclear Deterrence working group. And one of the things we're hoping to do is to actually, heaven forbid, have dialogues and get these people in the room and see it. And, one of the things too is I think it's important to understand the interest and worldview of each side. And I think that, for example, the people who work on nuclear deterrence every day, can they explain to those who are advocates of disarmament this idea that they have that we use nuclear weapons every day, the fact that the arsenal exists as deterrence? And can those who advocate disarmament, talk about reasons why they, don't need nuclear weapons, or reasons why, even countries who are under the umbrella or have nuclear weapons don't actually rely on their arsenals for 99% of actually security related incidents? And that's not an answer. It's not a solution. It doesn't do anything, but we just need people to talk to one another. Thanks.
Thanks, Stephen. Hassan?
Yeah, thank you. I completely agree with what Rebecca and Stephen mentioned. I think there is a significant difference in terms of power and platform and opportunities provided to questions about how to use nuclear weapons, or how to think about nuclear weapons in the context of deterrence versus sort of disarmament or an alternative, different future of a world without nuclear weapons. There is absolutely there's a huge difference in terms of power, opportunities, platforms, and so on. And I sometimes feel that because of this, there is sometimes the implicit, or there is the desire of the disarmament camp to sort of get the attention and try to convince the other side, or I don't know, maybe get also some of that spotlight and so on. And I think the real opportunity isn't somewhere else. I think the real opportunity is, I think perhaps I go back to that, my very early comment in the first question that was posed, is actually to sort of have your head down and sort of do serious, credible work. Do networking in the sort of small n. Make sure that the research is relevant and speaks, can be seen as credible, and try to find venues for that to come out. And I think it's a long-term conversation. And I think it's a long-term conversation that is not going to be settled in anyone's lifetime around this, involved in this call. And may you all live very, very long. And I think the secret to it is to look at it, speak to the debate that you want to have in the future.
Great, thanks. So in the interest of keeping the train running on time, I just want to point out we have about 3 minutes left and 3 speakers that I want to recognize. Olamide.
Thank you, Matt. I'll be quite brief. I think to build upon what my co-panelists have said, it's not just about the two communities speaking to each other, but also recognizing the fact that we have a very different audiences. And this is, almost structurally predetermined by one side. What I mean to not speak in code is, as academics and a lot of the nuclear ban advocates, the platforms we have are usually public facing. We get to engage a lot with grassroots movements. We get to engage a lot with, individuals and lay people with an interest in this. But at the end of the day, the debate or the question of nuclear deterrence has been sort of securitized, removed from any sort of democratic discourse to such a degree that regardless of the influence that academics and activists have on grassroots movements, that doesn't necessarily directly translate into policy change at the state level. And so, just that recognition shows that there's hardly any interest or incentive for the two sides to communicate. That's one. And secondly, as Hassan highlighted, the power imbalance, the difference in funding structures, the difference in access is just remarkable. So remarkable that, you know, it almost seems as though the centers of power have to make a more proactive approach to speak to academics and activists. And I'll pause there. Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you. Sholv?
Thank you. We're running out of time and I've already talked a lot, so I'll be really, really quick. I just thought I'd say, I think if our objective is to get at something close to the truth, I think talking to people is always good, to have dialogue and to understand where other people are coming from and to understand the different arguments is crucial. But if the question is to change nuclear politics, then personally, I think the social mechanism of persuasion is extremely overrated. You know, I think if you're Beatrice Finn of ICANN, you're not going to be persuaded that nuclear deterrence is a good thing. And if you were persuaded of that, you would be replaced because you have a role in an organization. And likewise, if you're Vladimir Putin, you're not going to convince Vladimir Putin that disarmament is suddenly a great thing. It's probably not going to happen. So for me, nuclear politics is not really about persuasion. It's about power and ideology and pressure. And I think that's where change is going to come from, if it is going to change.
Thank you. Tamara.
Yeah, thank you, Francesca, for the question. I think, and many of us know, verification is another space or conversation where these two groups are often sitting at the same table. The difference is that one group says, you know, first we have to create the conditions, maybe we can do this stuff in 100 years. The other says, let's do this now. And I think, you know, when we look at a lot of that work, one thing that strikes me is that it really revolves a lot around models and imaginary countries and the abstract, including my own work. And I think a place where we start to take that conversation and engagement between the communities to a more useful space is when we start to get into the specifics. And that includes, you know, the intersection of nuclear force structures and conventional force structures, to take, you know, the engagement to a space where we're either addressing real concerns and talking about them, or we're exposing places where there actually isn't a real argument or a legitimate argument for concern about why we can't act or implement this now. So I'll stop there.
Great. Well, I just want to close by thanking everyone for a really rich and informative discussion today. Thank you to all the audience members for coming and for asking questions. I think we have a nice agenda here of some future research questions that have come out of this, and hopefully we'll have opportunities to continue the discussion. Francesca, did you want to say any final words?
The only final word is I want to thank you all. Thank you, Matt, as well. And to all of you, we are going to set up a website on the research network on rethinking nuclear deterrence. We will do plenty of other public events throughout the next 2 years, where we really want to encourage the public, scholars, policymakers to engage in a series of conversations. And so please follow us. We will tweet also the network, the website when it's up.
Great. Thanks, everyone.